April 18th, 1942. Over the black void of the East China Sea, 16 American bombers flew on fumes and faith. Their engines sputtered a prayer. Their mission, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's audacious strike on Tokyo, was over. A pinprick of defiance against an empire. A moral victory. But survival was another matter entirely. The landing strips promised in Kuzhou, deep within nationalist China, were a mirage. They were too far. The fuel was gone. Hope was gone. One by one, the B-25s began to die. They fell from the night sky like dying embers. 15 planes. 75 men scattered across the hostile, sleeping landscapes of Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. They crashed on remote mountainsides, ditched in coastal shoals, and bailed out into a darkness as absolute as it was terrifying. They were heroes just hours before. Now they were just men. Frightened men. Injured men. Lost men, hunted by the most powerful army in Asia. Each tick of the clock brought the Japanese patrols closer. Capture was a certainty. Torture and execution, a probability. Down below, in the quiet villages nestled between terraced hills, they saw the fire in the heavens. They heard the sound of tearing metal. They felt the earth shake. Then, in the eerie silence of the pre-dawn mist, they found them. The strange visitors. Men who seemed to have fallen from the moon itself, tangled in white silk, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock and exhaustion. Nobody knew who they were. The whispers started immediately, spreading from house to house, a current of fear and astonishment. Rumors always started. They were Russian spies, some said. No, German defectors, others insisted. One old woman swore they were ghosts, long-nosed devils sent as a bad omen. A few who had listened to the forbidden radio broadcast from Chongqing dared to voice a different word. Meiguo. Americans. Allies. But ally was just a word. These were strangers. Bleeding strangers. The choice arrived with the rising sun, stark and unforgiving. A choice made not by generals or politicians, but by farmers, fishermen, teachers, and midwives. A choice with no orders from above, no promise of reward, no guarantee of anything but peril. To help these men was to actively defy the Japanese Imperial Army. To help was to invite utter ruin. It was a death sentence for you, for your family, for your entire village. Everyone understood the calculus of survival under occupation. It was a simple, brutal equation. The Japanese were everywhere. Their spies were everywhere. A single foreign-made boot print in the mud, a discarded American cigarette, the scent of unfamiliar medicine. Any one of these things could lead to a midnight raid, to questions answered with a bayonet, to a public execution designed as a warning. To help was madness. Yet they helped. A villager named Liao Xiuan, a simple farmer, heard a cry in the mountains and walked for hours into the darkness to find a wounded pilot and carry him to safety. In a coastal village, Ma Liangshui and his wife, Zhao Xiaobao, spotted a parachute descending and ran towards it, not away. They brought the downed airman into their small home, offered him their finest food, fried eggs and shrimp, a treasure in a time of starvation, and began the dangerous work of concealment. This was not one act of courage. It was thousands. A conspiracy of compassion unfolded across hundreds of square miles. They hid the Americans in secret compartments beneath floorboards. They disguised them in haystacks and smuggled them onto fishing junks. They dressed the tall foreigners in the simple blue coats of peasants, teaching them to stoop and keep their eyes down. They guided them along ancient, forgotten paths, a silent, shuffling procession moving only under the cover of darkness. It was a human chain, each link representing a family willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. The reprisal, when it came, was biblical in its fury. The Japanese High Command initiated the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign, a name that appears as a sterile footnote in official war histories. The file was codenamed Operation Seigo. Its stated objective was tactical: to completely destroy the air bases from which the Americans could attack our homeland. But its unspoken objective, the one carried out with monstrous precision by the soldiers on the ground, was pure, unadulterated vengeance. For 3 months, they turned the region into a charnel house. They were looking for 75 flyers. They punished millions. Soldiers swept through towns demanding information. Those who knew nothing were tortured until they confessed to something. Those who knew something and stayed silent were killed as an example. Entire families were machine-gunned in village squares. Wells were poisoned with cholera and dysentery pathogens, an early horrifying form of biological warfare. The Japanese 17th Army, in a post-operation report, noted the extreme measures taken to pacify the population. 250,000 people. That was the estimated price. For saving 64 American airmen, 250,000 Chinese civilians were murdered. It remains one of the largest and least known atrocities committed in retaliation for a single act of civilian defiance during the Second World War. Why? Why did they do it? The easy answer is a shared enemy. The easy answer is politics. But that answer crumbles when you stand in the quiet bamboo groves where men were hidden, or when you listen to the hushed voice of an elder whose father was executed for giving an American a drink of water. The true reasons are not recorded in state papers or diplomatic cables. They are etched into the memories of the survivors, preserved in the stories passed down like heirlooms and buried with the bones of the dead. This is the story a world at war chose to overlook. It is an investigation into the anatomy of courage, the cost of compassion, and a sacred debt between two peoples that was written in blood and sealed by an unbreakable promise to remember. Chapter 1, May 16th, 1944. Hancock County, Iowa. They said it was a camp for prisoners of war. They were wrong, terribly wrong. The land was flat. So flat you could watch your dog run away for 3 days. Corn in May was just a green promise pushing through the black, rich soil. The sky was immense, a silent blue ocean stretching from one horizon to the other, punctuated only by the occasional grain elevator or the steeple of a Lutheran church. The war was 1,000,000 miles away. A headline in the Des Moines Register, a crackle on the radio telling of battles in places nobody in Iowa could pronounce. Anzio, Casino, the Crimea. Just names. Here there was only peace. The hum of a John Deere tractor, the lowing of cattle, the wind whispering through last year's corn stubble. A profound, endless peace. And then they came, 300 of them. In the back of canvas-covered army trucks that kicked up clouds of dust on the gravel roads. They were Germans, Afrika Korps mostly. Captured in the heat and sand of Tunisia. Now they were here. In the middle of America's heartland, they were prisoners. But they didn't act like prisoners. Not really. They were polite. They worked on the farms, replacing the local boys who were off fighting their countrymen in Europe. They fixed machinery. They harvested sugar beets. They spoke quiet, guttural German amongst themselves and broken, careful English to the farmers. They looked thin, but their eyes were sharp. They were soldiers, German soldiers, in Iowa. The official designation was Camp Algona Branch 17, a simple name for a simple purpose. The folder in the sub-depot command office was thin, too thin. It stated the objective: utilizing prisoner of war labor to alleviate agricultural shortages in the Midwest. A sensible plan, a pragmatic solution. The report was signed by a major general nobody had heard of. The paper felt too new. The ink, too black. It was all neat, tidy, and completely unbelievable. Nobody believed it. But the facts were there. Facts are always truthful. The men's names were ordinary: Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufman, Kleine, Gross, men who were bakers and mechanics and farmers back home. They worked hard. They ate the food they were given. They followed the rules, but there was one who was different. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, 42 years old, an engineer from Dresden, the file said, captured near the Kasserine Pass. Unlike the others, Richter did not work the fields. He was exempt. Medical reasons, the camp commander, a tired captain from Dubuque named Holloway, would say. But Richter looked healthier than any of them. He had the lean, predatory stillness of a wolf. And he didn't rest. He watched. He just watched. Watched the sky. Watched the trains on the Rock Island line 2 miles south. Watched the men. The whispers started in the diner in Britt, in the feed store in Garner. They said the guards weren't regular military police. They were too quiet, too observant. They didn't have the flat-footed walk of a regular MP. They had the eyes of watchers. G2, someone said. Army intelligence. Someone who knew things whispered that word. And why would G2 be watching a few hundred farm laborers in Hancock County? The locals called them the Dutchmen, a soft, harmless word for a strange situation, a way to make it normal, but they weren't Dutch, not Dutch at all. Deutsch, Germans, corrupted by American tongues into something gentler, something that didn't sound like Panzers and Stukas and the Blitz, something that didn't sound like the enemy, but they were the enemy. Sergeant Frank Miller knew it, 31 years old from Chicago's South Side. He was one of the guards, one of the watchers. He was supposed to be in Italy, but a training accident with a faulty mortar had left him with a permanent limp and a stateside assignment. He hated the flatness. He hated the quiet. Most of all, he hated the feeling that he was guarding something far more important than a few hundred krauts. He watched Richter. He saw that the Hauptmann was never idle. He carried a small black notebook. He was always sketching, not the cornfields, not the quaint farmhouses, not the big Iowa sky. Something else. One afternoon, Miller watched him from the guard tower through binoculars. Richter was standing near the western fence line. He wasn't sketching, he was pacing. Deliberately. He would walk 20 paces, stop, pull out a small pocket compass, make a note, and then turn 90 degrees and pace again. Pacing, counting, looking at his compass. Not like a man stretching his legs, like an engineer, a surveyor. He was measuring the camp. He was mapping it. That night, the unease in Miller's gut turned into a cold, hard certainty. The rules were clear. Do not engage. Do not interfere. Observe and report. But the reports went into a locked file box and disappeared. Miller had seen the trucks. They came after midnight twice a week from the direction of the rail line. They weren't carrying food. The crates were too heavy, too uniform. Men with civilian clothes and military haircuts supervised the unloading under portable floodlights. The prisoners, including Richter, did the work. They moved with a purpose Miller had only seen in newsreels of German factory workers, a disciplined, rhythmic efficiency. This wasn't a farm labor camp. It was something else. A workshop. A laboratory. The air grew heavy. A storm was coming. Miller could feel the pressure dropping. He waited until 2 in the morning, when the camp was silent except for the chirping of crickets and the distant rumble of a freight train. He left his post a court-martial offense. He slipped across the damp grass toward the barracks where the officers were housed. Barrack C. Richter's barrack. The light was off. Miller moved to the small window, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to know. He had to see. He found a loose board on the side of the building, just as he'd noted a week earlier. He pried it open with his trench knife. The smell of unwashed bodies, stale bread, and something else. Something chemical like ozone or burnt wiring hit him. He pulled a small flashlight from his belt, its beam wrapped in red celluloid. He swept the light across the Spartan room, a neatly made bunk, a small stack of approved books, and on the floor next to the bunk, a piece of paper had fallen out of the black notebook. It must have dropped when Richter was sleeping. A sketch. Miller's breath caught in his throat. It was not a map of the camp. It was a diagram, incredibly detailed. Wires, tubes, plates, and strange concentric circles. It was a piece of complex machinery. An electrical device of some kind. Miller was no engineer, but he knew what technical drawings looked like. This was one, precise, professional. And at the bottom, in neat block letters, was a notation in German. A single word. Miller didn't speak German, but he'd seen that word before. In intelligence briefings, in classified memos about Nazi wonder weapons. Maybe from MGU. Maybe from command trips. He wasn't certain. The train whistle shrieked in the night, a mournful, lonely sound. And then he saw the other word, written in the margin next to a complex array of what looked like triggering mechanisms. A word he did understand, a place. Los Alamos. Chapter 2. May 16th, 1944. Hancock County, Iowa. They said it was a camp for prisoners of war. They were wrong, terribly wrong. The land was flat. So flat you could watch your dog run away for 3 days. A sea of green corn and golden soy, stretching to a horizon that was a perfect, clean line. And on this flat, honest land sat a scar. A grid of tar paper barracks and barbed wire fences called Camp Algona. Officially, it was a branch camp for the main facility, a place for low-risk German prisoners to help with the farm labor shortage. That was the story everyone knew. A simple story for a simple time. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? The prisoners arrived by train. Thin men in faded Africa Corps uniforms, their desert tan bleached pale by the Iowa sun. Young sailors pulled from the cold Atlantic, dazed and grateful to be alive. The local paper, the Kossuth County Advance, kind of ran a photograph. A smiling German, 20-year-old Unteroffizier Paul Schultz, holding a basket of sweet corn. He looked like any farm boy. The caption read, "Fritz helps the war effort." It was folksy. It was reassuring. It was a lie. A comfortable lie. The first crack in the story wasn't a crack at all. It was a whisper. A rumor that drifted over coffee at the farmers' co-op in Algona. Some of the prisoners weren't soldiers, not soldiers at all. A farmer named Dale Jensen, who had a contract to supply milk to the camp, swore he heard them talking. Not about battles in the Kasserine Pass or convoy routes. They were arguing about quantum mechanics, about heavy water moderation. Jensen didn't know the words, but he knew they weren't the words of foot soldiers. He told the sheriff. The sheriff, a man named Howard Gillespie, told him to drink less coffee. But the facts were there. Facts are always truthful. In Barrack B4, quartered with a dozen captured infantrymen, was Dr. Arndt Fischer, a chemist. Not just any chemist. A senior project manager from the IG Farben-Leuna works, the heart of Germany's synthetic fuel production. Next to him slept Professor Emil Hauser, an aerodynamics expert from the Messerschmitt Design Bureau in Augsburg, the man who helped shape the wings of the Me-262 jet fighter. They were listed on the official roster as Obergefreiter Fischer and Feldwebel Hauser, captured near Cherbourg, the paperwork said. But they had never been to Cherbourg. They had never worn a uniform. How did they get here? The security was the next clue. It was too much. Far too much for a few hundred demoralized prisoners. The outer perimeter was standard, but the camp itself, especially the northern section, was different. The guards weren't local reservists. They were men from the 754th Military Police Battalion, a unit that specialized in high-security installations. They were commanded by a Colonel Albert P. Lambert, a severe, hawk-faced man from the War Department who flew in twice a month from Washington. He never spoke to the local authorities. He never smiled. His men patrolled the inner fences with dogs, German shepherds. An irony nobody found amusing. They weren't keeping prisoners in. They were keeping the world out. And then there was Barrack C7. It stood alone at the far northern edge of the compound. It was surrounded by its own taller fence, topped with a triple strand of barbed wire. There were floodlights on it. Floodlights that burned all night long, painting the prairie in a stark, artificial daylight. Even at dawn. Even in peacetime, they would later learn, the lights burned. No prisoners from the general population ever went near it. The guards on C7 were a special detail, handpicked by Lambert himself. They carried Thompson submachine guns, not M1 carbines. Thompsons. At night, the trucks came, not the usual Army deuce and a halves. They were closed-back commercial haulers, black or dark green. Their license plates were always caked with mud, even on dry days. They would rumble down the gravel service road, their engines a low growl in the immense Iowa silence, and back right up to the loading dock of Barrack C7. Crates were unloaded. Heavy crates handled with extreme care. Sometimes there were cylinders. Long, metallic cylinders. What was inside? Nobody knew. The truck drivers were civilians, grim-faced men who never left their cabs. They would get their papers signed by a lieutenant, then drive away, back into the blackness. Maybe to Chicago, maybe to Omaha, maybe from somewhere else entirely. That's how it began, with whispers and strange trucks in the night. The folder was thin, manila-colored, its corners soft from handling. It was declassified in 1978. Most of it was redacted with thick black ink, but the title was clear: Project Olympus, a bland, forgettable name. Inside, a memorandum from the Office of the Army Chief of Staff for Intelligence, G2. Dated March 2nd, 1944. It spoke of a new directive. It used clean, sterile words like intellectual asset extraction and long-term scientific exploitation. Assets, not prisoners. Exploitation, not internment. The memo outlined a program to identify, locate, and acquire German scientists. Key scientists, the ones who were indispensable to the Reich's most advanced weapons programs. The list of targets was an appendix. Appendix A: Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. 112 names in total. Physicists, chemists, rocketry engineers, electronics specialists. A shopping list for the future, compiled months, even years before the men were captured. And then the main thing started. The men in Barrack C7 were different. Klaus Richter, a 47-year-old theoretical physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. He was Germany's leading mind on nuclear fission. He was taken from his Berlin apartment in the dead of night by men who spoke perfect German, but who were not Gestapo. Werner von Braun's top propulsion engineer, a man named Horst Klein, was captured during a supposed partisan ambush while on leave in the Black Forest. An ambush that never happened. They were ghosts. Men who had officially died in bombing raids or disappeared on the Eastern Front, according to German records. But they were alive. They were alive and well in Hancock County, Iowa. They were allowed to work. They were given books, slide rules, drafting tables. They were given everything they needed. Everything except their freedom. They were the most valuable spoils of war. Their minds, their knowledge. 312 prisoners were in Camp Algona, but only the 24 in C7 mattered. The rest were camouflage. Human camouflage. Hundreds of men, their lives and labor used to hide the existence of a few. $6 million were allocated to Project Olympus in 1944 alone. $6 million. That was the cost of a destroyer. The cost of a squadron of fighters. $6 million to build a secret laboratory disguised as a prison, staffed by the enemy's best minds in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes a black Ford Deluxe sedan would arrive. Quietly. 2 men in dark suits would get out. They would go into C7 with Colonel Lambert. An hour later, they would emerge with one of the scientists. The scientist would be carrying a small briefcase. They would get in the sedan and drive away. 2 weeks later, they would return. The scientist would look tired, thinner, but his eyes would have a different look, a look of terrible knowledge. Where did they go? Rumors in the intelligence community spoke of trips, command trips, to the University of Chicago, to Los Alamos in New Mexico, to Wright Field in Ohio. They were consultants, unwitting, captive consultants for the Manhattan Project. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on October 3rd, 1944. A new transport arrived, but this time it wasn't men. It was equipment. Shipped directly from a captured Luftwaffe research facility near Peenemünde. The manifest was a single cryptic code word found in a file years later. The file was called Die Glocke, the bell. The crates were unloaded into C7, the security tripled. That night, the power draw from the local grid spiked so high it caused a blackout in the town of Tatanka, 8 miles away. Sergeant Frank Miller of the 754th was on duty that night. Decades later, his hands still trembled when he spoke of it. He heard a sound from inside C7. Not a machine sound, a low, powerful hum. A hum that vibrated through the soles of his boots, up his spine, and made his teeth ache. He crept to the small, reinforced window of the barracks, the one that was never supposed to be looked through. He saw scorch marks on the concrete floor. A perfect black circle. He saw the German scientists. Richter, Hauser, the others. They were standing back against the walls, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. And in the center of the room, hovering 6 inches above the floor, was something that shimmered under the harsh glare of the floodlights. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an engine. It was something else entirely, and it was not made by American hands. Chapter 3, May 16, 1944. Hancock County, Iowa. The men in Camp Algona weren't soldiers, not really. That was the first secret, the one hidden in plain sight. The official story was simple, clean. They were Germans, captured members of the Afrika Korps and the Kriegsmarine, shipped to the middle of nowhere to wait out the war farming beats and mending fences for the local population. A tidy solution. The locals believed it. The newspapers reported it. It was a lie, a clean, simple lie. Everybody saw them. Saw the buses unloading men in drab uniforms at the train depot in Algona. Saw the work details guarded by young American GIs trudging out to the fields under the vast, indifferent Iowa sky. But they weren't seeing what was really there. They saw uniforms. They saw a language they didn't understand. They saw the enemy. Tamed, harmless, defeated. That's what they were told to see. And what you are told to see is usually what you see. Nothing more. Sheriff Frank Brody saw more. Brody was 58. He had a face carved from prairie granite and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been sheriff of Hancock County for 20 years. He knew the land. He knew the people. He knew the sound of a sick cow and the smell of a coming storm. And he knew something was wrong at Camp Algona. Deeply wrong. It started with the hands. He'd seen the prisoners up close one afternoon, fixing a culvert on Highway 18. Their hands were soft, uncalloused. The hands of clerks, of teachers, of men who held pens, not rifles. The hands of men who had never dug a foxhole in their lives. These were not the hands of Rommel's desert fighters, not a chance. Then there were the names. Brody had a source, a young corporal named O'Malley who worked in the camp administration office. A kid from Des Moines who owed him a favor. O'Malley would talk, not much. Just whispers over a warm beer at the VFW hall in Britt. He'd give Brody names from the prisoner roster. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufman, Kleine, Gross. Common names. But then there were others. Names O'Malley had to spell out. Fletner, von O'Hine, Richter. Names that meant nothing to a corporal from Des Moines. They meant something to Brody. He'd seen a name like that once in a copy of Popular Science before the war. A pioneer in jet propulsion. A genius. What was a man like that doing in Iowa, pretending to be a captured U-boat mechanic? It made no sense. None of it made sense. The prisoners were too respected. The American Guards, led by a tight-lipped major from the Army Corps of Engineers named Elias Vance, treated them with a strange, almost fearful deference. They weren't ordered around, they were consulted. Brody saw it himself, a broken pump at the water station. The American sergeant scratching his head, cursing. And then one of the prisoners, a tall, thin man with spectacles named Dr. Ernst Vogel, was brought over. He didn't touch the pump. He just looked, pointed. spoke a few quiet words in German. The sergeant listened, nodded. 10 minutes later, the pump was working. Vogel was escorted back to his barracks. Not like a prisoner, like a visiting professor. The folder was tucked under Major Vance's arm when his car blew a tire just outside of Garner. Brody, on his way back from a call, stopped to help. Vance was furious, his face a mask of controlled panic. He tried to hide the folder, but not before Brody saw the stamped title on its cover. It wasn't POW roster or camp operations. It was 2 words in stark black ink. Project Pioneer. Vance saw him looking. His eyes went cold, colder than a January night on West Twin Lake. He said nothing. Brody said nothing. But the name was there, burned into Brody's mind. Project Pioneer. What in God's name was Project Pioneer? That's how it began. And then the main thing started. A week later, Corporal O'Malley slipped a document into Brody's hand during a handshake. It was a carbon copy of a shipping manifest, Manifest 734B, from a depot in Maryland. Destination, Camp Algona, Iowa. The items listed were bizarre. Not food, not uniforms, not medical supplies. The list included centrifuge components, high speed, 3 crates. Spectrometer, mass, 1 crate. Graphite bricks, purified, 12 pallets. And at the bottom, a summary description of the human cargo that had arrived on the same train. It did not say prisoners of war. It said something else. 3 words that made the hair on Brody's arm stand up. Specialized. Technical. Personnel. Specialized. Technical. Personnel. The words echoed in the quiet of Brody's office. Not soldiers, not sailors. Personnel. Like factory workers, like engineers, like scientists. 600 of them. That's more than the entire physics department at every university in the Midwest combined. 600 German scientists in the middle of an Iowa cornfield. The rumors grew stranger. The prisoners weren't captured in Africa at all. That was a cover. A fabrication. They whispered that the men had come on special orders. Secret surrenders negotiated in Sweden and Switzerland. Some said they were extracted, plucked right out of Peenemünde or the research labs in Berlin. Men who knew things. Things about rockets. Things about jets. Things about something else. Something new. Something terrible. A new kind of bomb. The whispers died whenever a stranger entered the room. The fear was real. One night, Deputy Miller, a young man with big ears and an even bigger sense of duty, called Brody at home. His voice was a strained whisper. A truck had arrived at the camp's east gate. A civilian truck. A big Peterbilt with an Illinois plate. No army markings at all. It came from the direction of Chicago. Miller said the cargo was unloaded under massive floodlights in total silence. The crates were long, wooden, and marked with a symbol he'd never seen before. A small triangle inside a circle. The guards overseeing the unloading weren't the usual GIs. They were different men. Dressed in plain fatigues with no insignia, carrying submachine guns. They moved with a chilling efficiency. They looked, Miller said, like they would kill you for breathing too loud. That was enough. Brody got in his Ford sedan and drove. He didn't go to the gate. He knew a spot a half-mile down the road, where a small rise in the land offered a clear view of the camp's administrative buildings through his binoculars. The lights burned in every window, electric lights in every room, even at 3 a.m, even in wartime. He focused on Barrack C, the one they said housed the most important men. The lights were on there, too. He waited. For an hour, then 2. The cold started to seep into his bones. Just as he was about to give up, a car approached the main gate. Not an army jeep. A black 1942 Buick Roadmaster, its chrome trim gleaming under the gatehouse lights. The car was waved through without stopping. It pulled up directly in front of Barrack C. The man who got out was not in uniform. He wore a dark civilian suit and a fedora. He carried a heavy-looking leather briefcase. And then Brody saw it. The door to the barracks opened. Dr. Klaus Richter, the man they said was a captured U-boat captain, stepped out. He wasn't stooped like a prisoner. He stood tall, expectant. The man in the suit walked toward him. There was no salute. There was no formality. Richter extended his hand. The visitor from Chicago took it. They shook hands, two colleagues meeting for a late-night consultation. They spoke for a moment, their faces illuminated by the light from the open doorway. They were speaking English. And as the visitor turned his head slightly, Brody's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face. He'd seen it in a magazine, a picture of the nation's top scientific minds. The man shaking hands with a German prisoner in the heart of Iowa? He was one of the men running the secret laboratory at the University of Chicago. He was one of the fathers of the bomb. Chapter 4, May 16th, 1944, Hancock County, Iowa. The men of Camp Algona never touched a shovel. They held slide rules. They didn't dig ditches. They debated differential equations in hushed, guttural German. This was the second secret. The one buried deeper than the first. They weren't prisoners. Not in any sense the Geneva Convention would recognize. They were assets. Old Man Hemmer, who farmed the adjacent 640 acres, told Sheriff Brody his concerns. He saw trucks, not army trucks. Sealed civilian trucks from companies he'd never heard of. Sterling Logistics, Apex Transport. They came at night, always at night. They didn't bring barbed wire or sacks of potatoes. They brought crates. Long wooden crates handled with the reverence a man gives to a sleeping child. Or a bomb. Sheriff Brody just nodded, smiled a tired smile. Told Hemmer the army knew what it was doing. But Brody saw it too. Everyone saw it. They just didn't speak of it. It was unpatriotic. It was dangerous. One man, a bartender in Algona named Fitzpatrick, talked too much about the strange lights, about the low hum that sometimes carried on the night wind. Fitzpatrick was visited by two men in dark suits and hats. Men who didn't look like they came from Iowa, or anywhere nearby. After that, Fitzpatrick only talked about the weather. That's how it began. The official designation for the cargo was Technical and Scientific Materiel Class 4. That's what the manifest said. But inside the camp, inside the newly constructed Barrack D, it was something else entirely. Barrack D had no bunks. It had long tables, blackboards that covered entire walls, and shelves, groaning under the weight of books. Not novels, not Bibles. Textbooks. German textbooks on aerodynamics, metallurgy, rocketry, and theoretical physics. Electric lights burned in every room, all night long, even when the moon was bright enough to read by. Not for security, for study. The folder in a locked file cabinet at the War Department in Washington was called Project Ithaca. It was the brainchild of a quiet, spectacled man named Dr. Eris Thorne, a physicist on loan from the University of Chicago. His memo from October of 1943 was direct, blunt. It argued that Germany's greatest weapon was not its panzers, not its U-boats, but its mines. The report stated, "We are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting a generation of scientific genius. Capturing them is not enough. We must acquire them." Acquire them. A cold word, a corporate word. And so they did. These weren't men pulled from the mud of Normandy or the sands of Africa. These were men taken from clean, well-lit laboratories, from university lecture halls, from the experimental facilities at Peenemünde and the research divisions of IG Farben. They were handpicked. The list of names in the Ithaca file read like a who's who of German science. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. Men who had been declared killed in action on the Eastern Front or lost in bombing raids over Berlin. Lies. All of it. They were here, in Iowa. Take, for example, Dr. Wilhelm Brandt, age 51, Germany's leading expert in synthetic fuel production. His official Wehrmacht file, a copy of which was in the Ithaca folder, showed him transferred to a non-existent Panzer division outside Minsk in January. He disappeared. But a separate, heavily redacted OSS report detailed his extraction from a safe house in Bern, Switzerland. 2 agents, a silent car, a flight from a private airfield, and then Iowa. Or 29-year-old Kurt Vogel, a protege of Messerschmitt, an aeronautical engineer whose work on swept-wing design was considered 5, maybe 10 years ahead of anything the Allies had. He wasn't captured. He defected. A deal was made. His family out of Stuttgart, his research notes saved from the fire. In exchange for what? The secrets of the Me-262 jet fighter. All of them. The rumors among the handful of American guards, all of whom had signed secrecy oath that carried the penalty of treason, were wild. They whispered that the Germans weren't prisoners at all. They were guests. Privileged guests. They received better food. They had a library. They had drafting tables and equipment that the guards, farm boys mostly, couldn't begin to understand. They saw the camp's commander, Colonel Miller, a stern West Point man, walking with these prisoners. Not in front of them or behind them. Beside them. Talking. Sometimes even laughing. This wasn't a prison. It was a think tank. A forced think tank. The tension grew day by day. The project was simple and monstrous. The Germans were to replicate their work, to write down every formula, every blueprint, every theory they had ever worked on. Everything. Their knowledge was being systematically drained from their heads and onto American paper. Translated by a small, terrified group of German-speaking academics brought in from Princeton and Yale. They were told it was for the war effort, to find weaknesses in German technology. But the work went beyond that. It wasn't about countering V-2 rockets. It was about building better ones. It wasn't about defending against German jets. It was about creating American jets. It was a transfer of power, a transfer of the future happening in a quiet, guarded corner of the American heartland. And then the main thing started. In early May, a new group arrived. Not engineers, not chemists. Physicists, 4 of them. They were kept separate from the others in a small, isolated building at the far end of the compound. Barrack G. They didn't talk to the others. They were watched more closely. Their leader was a man named Dr. Erich Zimmermann, a gaunt figure with haunted eyes who had been second in command at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. Nobody knew what they were working on. Their blackboards were wiped clean every night by an intelligence officer, a nervous young captain named Wallace. Their notes were collected and flown directly to a place in the New Mexico desert. The other Germans, the rocket men and the engineers, looked at Barrack G with a mixture of fear and awe. They knew who Zimmermann was. They knew what he did. Late one night, a guard on patrol, a corporal named Dean Jensen, brother of a friend of Farmer Hemmer, crept close to the wire fence of Barrack G. He heard them arguing. In German. He only knew a few words, picked up from his grandfather. Deutsch. Not Dutch at all. But he heard one word clearly. A word spoken with a terrible, quiet reverence. Uranverein. He didn't know what it meant. He just knew it sounded important. Frightening. He wrote it down on a scrap of paper, phonetically. Uranverein. It was the name of the German nuclear program, the Uranium Club. And in the flat, quiet cornfields of Iowa, the work continued. Chapter 5, May 16th, 1944, Hancock County, Iowa. He was not a prisoner of war. He was never a prisoner of war. This was the central, unspoken truth of Camp Algona. Dr. Klaus Richter, age 52, former head of theoretical physics at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. He had not been captured on a U-boat or fished from the wreckage of a Messerschmitt. He had walked into the American embassy in Bern, Switzerland on October 11th, 1943, carrying a single leather briefcase and a proposal that made J. Edgar Hoover's blood run cold. And now he was here. In Iowa. He was the director. The others, the so-called prisoners, they were his team. Handpicked. Men he had taught, men he had mentored, men whose minds he trusted above all others. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Klein, Gross. a pantheon of German physics and engineering, plucked from transit camps and interrogation centers by silent men in dark sedans. They were flown not to England for questioning, but to Washington, D.C., and then by a blacked-out train to the endless cornfields of the Midwest. To him, to Richter. They all answered to Richter. Nobody on the outside knew. The guards didn't know. Not really. They saw a quiet, stern-faced man who walked with a slight limp, a man the other Germans treated with a deference that bordered on fear. The official story was that he was a high-ranking officer, too important for manual labor. A general, perhaps. They called him the Old Man. They saw him spend his days in the camp library, a long, low building that was always kept at a cool temperature, even on the hottest Iowa days. Electric lights burned in every room, even at dawn, even on a bright summer afternoon. Rumors existed. Of course, rumors existed. Sergeant Frank Miller, a farm boy from Mason City, swore he saw crates being unloaded in the dead of night. Not munitions, not food. Long, slender boxes of specialized glass tubes and heavy spools of copper wire. Private Carl Jenkins told a story in a hushed voice over lukewarm beer about seeing blueprints through an uncurtained window. They weren't for a tank, or a plane, or any machine he could recognize. They looked like mazes. Intricate, impossible mazes. A web of terrifying geometry. The project had a name, a secret name, buried in a file cabinet in a sub-basement of the War Department in Washington. The folder was thin, manila, stamped top secret in faded red ink. Inside, the project was not called Operation Overlord or Operation Torch. It had a designation that was both bureaucratic and chilling. Special Project 734. The official summary was brief, deceptively simple. Feasibility study and theoretical modeling based on captured enemy intelligence. Captured intelligence. That was the lie they told themselves, the lie they printed on paper. Richter hadn't been captured. He had defected. He hadn't brought intelligence. He had brought the entire German atomic program with him. Or at least the key to unlocking it, the key to beating it. That was the secret inside the secret, the real purpose of Camp Algona. It wasn't about building an American bomb. Oppenheimer was already doing that in the desert of New Mexico. This was something different, something darker. A man whose name was whispered with reverence in the halls of Göttingen and Heidelberg, a protege of Max Planck, a man who had debated quantum states with Niels Bohr over schnapps and cigars in Copenhagen before the world went mad, was now working for the United States Army in a wooden hut surrounded by barbed wire. He was working on a problem, a German problem, a Heisenberg problem. The folder stated it clearly on page 3. A report, authored by a shadowy figure from the Office of Strategic Services, laid out the stakes. Werner Heisenberg, Richter's former colleague and bitter rival, was close, maybe very close, to building a German bomb. How close, nobody knew. That was the terror, the uncertainty, an unknown variable in the equation of war. So they brought in Richter, the only man alive who thought like Heisenberg, who knew his shortcuts, who could anticipate his conceptual leaps, who could predict his failures. The men in the library weren't building a weapon. They were building a ghost, a phantom image of the German program. They were running calculations, thousands of them, on graphite purity, on heavy water production, on isotopic separation techniques. They were wargaming the physics, trying to find the flaw, the one critical miscalculation that Heisenberg's team was bound to make. A German atomic project, on American soil, with American funding. A shadow project run by defectors to predict the outcome of its twin brother back in the fatherland. But even that was not the whole truth. There was another man, an American, Colonel Davis Wallace of the Army Corps of Engineers. He was the camp's official commander, but he was no simple soldier. He was a quiet, thin man with pale eyes that missed nothing. He had a degree in physics from MIT, class of 1928. He spoke fluent German. He spent his evenings not in the officers' club, but in the library, with Richter. They would sit for hours. A plume of smoke from Wallace's cigarette, a cloud from Richter's pipe, surrounded by blackboards covered in chalk equations that looked like a madman's scripture. The guards were under strict orders never to approach the library after 10 p.m. Never. One night, a young corporal on patrol, a kid named O'Donnell, took a shortcut behind the building. The window was cracked open to let out the smoke. He heard voices, Wallace's flat Boston accent and Richter's guttural German English. He only caught a fragment, a few words that made no sense to him then, but would haunt him for the rest of his life. He heard Richter's voice, low and strained. "The calculations are stable, Colonel. The yield is predictable. But the secondary effects, we cannot model the secondary effects." A long pause. The scratch of a matchstick as Wallace lit another cigarette. Then Wallace's voice, cold as the Iowa winter. "The secondary effects are not our concern, Klaus. The only question that matters is, can we trigger the cascade?" Cascade. O'Donnell didn't know what it meant, but he heard the tone, the absolute finality in the colonel's voice, the desperate, terrible hope. They weren't just predicting the German bomb. They were looking for a way to use Heisenberg's own work against him, to turn his machine into a self-destruct mechanism from 5,000 miles away, a weapon to end the war. And then Richter said the words that stopped O'Donnell's heart. "Trigger it?" "Yes," the German scientist whispered. "But the chain reaction, it may not be limited to their reactor. The models show a possibility, a very small possibility, that it doesn't stop." May 16th, 1944, Hancock County, Iowa. Klaus Richter did not arrive in America by accident. He was not captured on a battlefield, a prize of war plucked from the wreckage of the Reich. He was delivered like a diplomatic pouch heavy with secrets. He had a price. That price was a project. The folder was thin, bound in cheap gray cardboard, the kind of folder a mid-level bureaucrat might misplace without a second thought. But its contents were the heaviest thing in North America. The title on the cover was typed, stark and black. Project Nabelkind. Project Fogchild. He had carried it with him from Germany, a dowry for his new allegiance. It was not a surrender. It was a business proposal. Nobody understood this. Not at first. They thought he was just another scientist. A valuable asset, yes. But one of many. They were wrong. Terribly wrong. Rumors followed him from the old world. Whispers in the hushed, smoke-filled offices of the OSS in Washington. Maybe from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. Maybe from Peenemünde. Maybe from one of Himmler's secret mountain laboratories. The whispers said he knew things. Things that even Werner Heisenberg was only guessing at. Things about critical mass, about implosion dynamics, about a fire that could eat the sky. That's how it all began. The man assigned to him was a ghost. Colonel Theron Wallace, United States Army. 42 years old. An engineering degree from MIT, class of 25. He was not a soldier who led men into battle. He was a soldier who managed assets, who understood complex systems, who could speak the cold language of physics and the brutal calculus of war. Wallace was the gatekeeper, the warden, the only American who truly knew what Richter was. He had read the file, all of it, the real file, not the sanitized version for the camp guards. The file that spoke of a meeting in Bern, Switzerland, in January of 1944. A meeting with Alan Dulles himself. A handshake in a quiet hotel room, a promise made, a project transferred. And then the main thing started. The first meetings between Richter and Wallace were not interrogations, they were seminars. They took place in a windowless room in the camp's administration building, a concrete box that smelled of damp earth and stale Chesterfield cigarettes. No guards were present. Just two men. One in a crisp uniform, the other in the drab fatigues of a prisoner he was not. On the table between them, Not maps of Europe, but Richter's notes. Pages upon pages of dense equations, elegant and terrifying. They talked of isotope separation, of neutron moderators, of tamper designs, of explosive lenses. Wallace would listen, his face a mask of concentration, making his own notes in a locked ledger. He was the student. He was the master. He was both. Richter was not alone. He had a team. They were the reason for the deception, the reason an entire camp was built on a lie. They were the men who held slide rules instead of shovels. Schneider, the expert on gaseous diffusion. Becker, the master machinist from the Essen Works. Wagner, the chemist who knew more about heavy water than any man alive. Kaufmann, the mathematician who could see chain reactions in his sleep. Kleine, Gross, Adler, Schmidt. 6 more names, a dozen in total. The apostles of the atom. They had all been brought over, separately, secretly. Some snatched from Italy, others from occupied France. Some, like Richter, had simply walked across a border with a briefcase and a code phrase. They were not prisoners. They were the most expensive acquisitions in the history of the United States military. $600 million. That was the rumored cost of the operation. $600 million. Almost $1 for every person in America. The project needed things. Impossible things. Materials that didn't officially exist in the quantities required. They needed graphite of impossible purity. They needed beryllium. They needed uranium. Not just any uranium. They needed the isotope. Uranium-235. An ounce of it was worth more than all the gold in Fort Knox. They whispered that it came on a submarine, a ghost ship. U-234, they said, a massive Type XB U-boat, its belly filled not with torpedoes but with 10 cases of uranium oxide, infrared fuses, and technical drawings, supposedly bound for Japan. But it never got to Japan. The official story said it surrendered off the coast of New Hampshire in May of 1945. The rumors in Camp Algona said otherwise. They said a U.S. destroyer met it in the mid-Atlantic, under a new moon in the summer of '44. A quiet transfer was made, crate by crate. The sub was then scuttled. Its crew vanished into the same discreet prison system that held other inconvenient truths. The project had its fuel. Electric lights burned in Richter's barracks all night. Barracks number 7. It was different from the others. It had a reinforced concrete floor poured in the dead of night by a specialist Army engineering crew from Omaha. It had its own dedicated power line, humming with a current that made the air feel thick and alive. Inside, chalkboards covered every wall, a frantic white web of German script and mathematical symbols. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting oscillators, counters, transformers. The other prisoners gave it a wide berth. They called it Die Hexenküche, the witch's kitchen. They could feel the energy coming off it, a low, constant thrum you felt in your teeth. Sometimes a truck would arrive after midnight. No headlights until it passed the main gate. Canvas covered, guarded by men with Thompson submachine guns who weren't the usual camp MPs. They were different. Hard-eyed men who didn't speak, who looked through you. They unloaded heavy, lead-lined boxes. They took things away. The work was progressing. Faster than Wallace had dared to hope. Faster than Washington believed possible. Richter was a prodigy, a monster, a miracle worker. He was building his device, his child. On the evening of May 16, 1944, the humming from Barrack 7 stopped. An hour passed in dead silence. The sudden quiet was more unnerving than the noise had ever been. At 2200 hours, a runner, a pale 20-year-old corporal named Miller, sprinted from the barracks to the administration building. He bypassed the guards, bursting directly into Colonel Wallace's office. He handed him a sealed envelope. Wallace tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper from a notepad. On it, 3 words were written in Klaus Richter's precise, angular hand. 3 German words. Das Kind weint. The child is crying. Chapter 7. May 16, 1944. Hancock County, Iowa. The official record of Klaus Richter's capture read like a boy's adventure novel. It was a lie. A beautiful, meticulously crafted lie. The report stated that Captain Klaus Richter, attached to the Hermann Göring Division, was taken on a forgotten stretch of road near Anzio, Italy. Taken after a fierce, brief firefight. There were witnesses, there were bodies, there was paperwork. All of it fake. Klaus Richter was never a captain. He had never held a gun in his life, and the firefight near Anzio never happened. The men who died on that road were German, but they were not killed by Americans. They were killed by their own. A special SS detachment. 6 men. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. Their job was simple: create a skirmish, fire on a specific car, and then die. To make the story real. To give it the weight of blood. A 22-year-old Unteroffizier named Franz Bauer was the designated survivor, meant to report the ambush. He was shot in the back by his own commander just to be sure. Just to be certain the lie would hold. This was the work of a man nobody knew. Not really. Colonel Harrison Vance. Office of Strategic Services. Vance was a phantom, a whisper in the halls of the Pentagon. Someone said he was a lawyer from Philadelphia. Someone else swore he was a philosophy professor from Yale. He existed only in the margins of top-secret memoranda. He ran an operation that technically did not exist. A ghost operation. It had no official name, no budget line, no charter. In the few files that dared to mention it, it was referred to by a single Greek letter. Chi. For Chimera. Operation Chimera. The art of stealing minds from the heart of the Third Reich. Vance didn't believe in brute force. He believed in leverage. He found scientists who were terrified. Scientists whose wives were Jewish. Scientists who had made a cynical joke in the wrong company. Scientists who saw the writing on the wall. The Götterdämmerung coming for Germany, and wanted out. He didn't offer them freedom. He offered them a cage. A gilded cage in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. But a cage where they could work, where their families would be safe. That was the deal. It was a pipeline. A secret railroad running through the war. It started in the hushed offices of Zurich banks and the smoke-filled backrooms of Lisbon cafes. It ran through Stockholm and Madrid. Vance had agents everywhere. They weren't spies in the traditional sense. They were talent scouts. They didn't look for military weaknesses. They looked for intellectual dissatisfaction. They carried lists of names: physicists, chemists, engineers, mathematicians, men who were more valuable than a panzer division. Not captured. Recruited. Not prisoners. Assets. Not enemies. Colleagues. The file on Richter was thick. Thicker than any of the others. His recruitment was the crown jewel of Operation Chimera. It began in 1942. A decoded cable from Baron read, "The alchemist is restless." That was Vance's code for Richter. Richter wasn't just another scientist. He was the key. He was working on something the Americans barely understood. Something the whispers from Germany called Spaltung. Fission. A new kind of fire. The power of a star in a box. But his project was stalled. Himmler's Ahnenerbe choked it with esoteric nonsense. Göring wanted a miracle weapon by Christmas. The pressure was immense. The stupidity was suffocating. Vance's man in Switzerland, a watchmaker named Dubois, made contact. The offer was not made in words. It was made in numbers. A single sheet of paper passed in a crowded train station. On it was an equation, not one of Richter's. An American equation. A progression on his own work. It was a message. It said, "We know what you are doing. We are doing it too. And we are ahead." That was the hook. The rest was negotiation. Richter demanded his core team, 6 men. He demanded their families be extracted first. He demanded a laboratory with unlimited resources. He demanded one more thing: a guarantee that his work would not be overseen by generals, only by scientists. Vance agreed to it all. The fake firefight at Anzio was the elaborate theater piece to cover the final exfiltration, a masterpiece of deception. Vance called it defection by proxy. 6 SS men died so that Klaus Richter could trade one master for another. And now, in the flat, featureless expanse of Hancock County, the work was reaching its conclusion. The debates over differential equations that the guards overheard were not academic. They were the final calculations. The slide rules and chalkboards were not for theoretical exercises. They were the devil's own abacus, counting down to 0. The hum from the locked building at the center of the camp, Building 7, was the sound of a new world being born, or an old one being destroyed. Nobody in Algona knew. Nobody in Iowa knew. Only a handful of men in Washington knew. Vance, a few others. They watched the teletype machine day and night, waiting for a message from Camp Algona. Late on the evening of May 16th, it came. The machine clattered to life. The message was short. 2 words. A location and a date. A coded confirmation that Richter's part was done. That the device, the core component he had designed, was ready for transport. Ready for assembly. Ready for the test. The message was not for Vance. It was for another man. A physicist in a different desert. A man named Oppenheimer. The paper tape read, Jornada del Muerto, July. A journey was about to begin. The journey of the dead man, from the quiet fields of Iowa to the searing sun of New Mexico. The chimera was about to become real, and nobody could possibly imagine what would happen next. What is the true weight of a life given back to you? Can a debt of honor, forged in desperation and paid for in blood, ever truly be settled? The official histories offer their clean, sterile answers. They speak of 75 men, American flyers scattered like seeds across the hostile, sleeping landscapes of Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, saved by an alliance of convenience. The story seems to end there, but it does not. The official record is a document of profound silence. It says nothing of the single leather briefcase a man carried into the American embassy in Bern, Switzerland, on October 11, 1943. Its contents a mystery that connects continents. It offers no explanation for the whispers of a farmer named Dale Jensen, who swore he heard German prisoners of war, men shipped to the middle of nowhere to farm beets, speaking of a shared secret that stretched back to the skies over China. The files are mute on the subject of Captain Klaus Richter of the Hermann Göring Division, a man who vanished on a forgotten road near Anzio, his fate a loose thread in a tapestry no one was meant to see. The fragments lie dormant, in archives, in memories, in the earth itself. They are pieces of a different war, a war fought not on battlefields but in the quiet spaces between people. History is written in ink. Memory is etched in the heart. The truth of those 75 men is not found in the cold language of physics or the brutal calculus of war that sent them there. It is not a story of assets managed or systems understood. The truth remained behind, in the villages, with the people who defied certain death. It was a choice made in an instant, under an immense and indifferent sky. It was not a strategy, it was an impulse. The impulse to see a falling man not as a soldier, not as a foreigner, not as an enemy of their occupiers, but as a son, a brother, a human being in need of shelter. They came as warriors, instruments of a global conflict. They were received as family. This was their defiance. Not with guns, but with bowls of rice. Not with tactical maneuvers, but with hidden doors and silent betrayals of the occupying forces. The blackboards in the mission schoolhouses taught one kind of lesson. The villagers taught another. A lesson in a currency that transcends nations. Abundance of spirit, abundance of humanity. The numbers tell one story. 250,000 Chinese civilians slaughtered in retaliation. The real story is in the transformations, in how hatred was met with hospitality, in how the uniform was stripped away, leaving only the man. The debt remains. It is not a thing that can be repaid with monuments or medals. It is a debt of silence, a shared burden of memory. It lives in the quiet nods of old men who still look to the sky. It lives in the letters from American grandsons to Chinese villages they have never seen. The truth was simpler and more profound than any propaganda. It was not about winning a war. It was about preserving a piece of the soul. Some secrets die with those who kept them. Others echo forever. Between the lines of declassified reports. Between the furrows of old farmland in the American West. Between the silence of two nations that have not yet learned how to speak of this shared past. Perhaps the real story was never about the 75 men who were saved. Perhaps it was about the countless villagers who, in saving them, saved a small part of the world's conscience. The story is not over. The threads are still there, waiting. Some secrets are not meant to be kept. They are meant to be lived,